Well, hey, we're going to shift now into our new sermon series on Luke. Let me start with this. The Oxford Dictionary officially recognizes a word or an expression each year, their word of the year, that's attracted some kind of great interest or usage. It kind of represents what's going on in the culture. So candidates, they collect candidate words, the editors at Oxford, and they collect candidate words, and they judge them based on how well do they represent the ethos and the mood of that particular year. Another criteria is it has to have some kind of cultural standing. It can't be a fad. It has to represent something that they think is going to stick around for a while. So just to give you a few examples, here's a few examples of recent words. In 2024, the most recent, their word of the year was brain rot. That's their word. It's the supposed deterioration of a person's mental or intellectual state, especially viewed as a result of overconsumption of material considered to be trivial or unchallenging, particularly online content. That's what the Oxford Dictionary says. Basically, they're acknowledging that we're rotting our brains with spending all this time looking at useless stuff online. In 2023, the word was riz. Any of you use that word? Riz? Gentlemen, if you want to get in good with your wives, tell her she has a lot of riz. This slang word was coined by a YouTube influencer. It's likely short for charisma. Riz, charisma. The word was first coined by this YouTuber. It's gotten very, very popular. It can be used as a verb or a noun. As a noun, you've got a lot of riz, right? As a verb, he really rizzed the crowd, kind of a thing. There's even a spectrum. W-riz means a lot of really good riz. L-riz means really bad or not very much riz. Well, a few years ago, the word of the year from Oxford was post-truth. Post-truth. Their definition was relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotional and personal belief. Did you catch that? Facts are less influential than emotions and personal belief. Oxford was saying that this idea of post-truth, that what you feel, what you think, is more important, more influential than facts. Now, if you're old enough to remember Time magazine, you might recall that back in the 1960s, they had this very famous cover that said, "Is God Dead?" They revived that cover the same year that Oxford said post-truth is now the word of the year. And they said this time, "Is truth dead?" Even Time magazine was recognizing what was going on in our culture. Is truth dead? Not just what is true, but does truth even exist? And so I think there's two questions for us. The first is, do you think truth exists? Do you believe truth even exists? And even if you do, if you say, well, of course, truth exists, do you really believe that matters? Does truth influence your life more than your personal preferences and more than your feelings and your emotions in terms of what's going on in your life? The Barna Research Group, if you know them, they did some research on this a few years ago, and I've got some of their stats here. The first one is they surveyed Christians who consider their faith important and attend church regularly. So this is Christians who consider their faith important and they attend church regularly. And what Barna found out is only about 17% of them actually have a true biblical worldview. They also found out that only about 23% of them agree what is morally right or wrong depends on what the individual believes. I'm sorry, that 23% of them, a quarter of them said, well, what's right or wrong is what you feel or what you believe. A quarter of them were post-truth people. These are people who go to church. The next one, Americans on their feelings around truth. Only 32% of Christian adults and 15% of all adults in the United States believe in moral absolutes. Only 9% of Christian teens and 4% of all teens believe in moral truths. This is what's going on in our culture. Here's Barna's conclusion after their research. They wrote, the virtual disappearance of this cornerstone of the Christian faith, that is, God has communicated a series of moral principles, of moral truths in the Bible that are meant to be the basis of our thoughts and our actions, regardless of our preferences or our feelings or our situations, is probably the best indicator of the waning strength of the Christian church in America today. It's not just out there in the culture, it's in our churches. Do we really understand what biblical truth is, and do we really believe that that's what should shape us and influence us? Not how we feel or our personal preferences or what we think about things. You know, it's interesting to me, this is nothing new. This is nothing new. If you go all the way back to the very beginning of time, in the creation story in Genesis, when Satan came and tempted Eve, look with me at what he said. Genesis chapter 3, verse 1. Now the serpent was more shrewd than any of the wild animals that the Lord had made. He said to the woman, is it really true? Is it really true that God said you must not eat from any tree in the orchard? The idea of questioning truth, God's truth, is not new. In fact, it's the very first way Satan tempted humanity. And it's how he continues to tempt us, to distract us, to deceive us today, confusing what is really true and what isn't. So why am I even talking about all of this? Well, today we're gonna start Luke, the Gospel of Luke, a new series on Luke. And what we're going to see is that Luke's purpose in writing his gospel was that we could know with certain truth who Jesus was and what he said and what he did. And ultimately, why any of that should matter to us. So here's what I want to do today is I want to basically do two things. I want to do some overview, kind of background introduction to the Gospel of Luke. And then we're going to take a look at the first 4 verses and just draw some conclusions as kind of the introduction to the book of Luke, the Gospel of Luke. So I'm going to break this up. We're going to break Luke up into 4 sections, if you will, sort of 4 mini-series of Luke. It's going to take us this fall and into next spring to get all the way through the book. We'll take some breaks in there for Christmas and Easter and some different things. But as we work our way through, we're going to follow this outline as 4 mini-series, if you will. And so the first one, the one we're kicking off today, I've titled Origin Story. We're going to cover chapters 1 through 4. We're going to see Jesus' birth and his baptism and his temptation and really him starting into ministry. And then we're going to look at chapters 5 through 9, and I've called that one Hometown because that one focuses on Jesus in Galilee, his hometown area. He started out close to home, and so we're going to see kind of his ministry in that area. And then the third one's going to be called Road Trip, covering chapters 10 to 18. Basically, Jesus takes his disciples, and he makes his way to Jerusalem. And so Luke kind of covers that road trip and what happens on that road trip. And then finally, the fourth one is going to be titled Jerusalem. And this is when Jesus enters Jerusalem, the things he does in Jerusalem, and ultimately his going to the cross, his death, his resurrection, and his ascension. They all take place in Jerusalem. So that's where we're headed in terms of the book of Luke. And so, like I said, what I want to do is start with kind of some background introduction information about Luke, just to kind of help orientate us about this book, and then we'll take a look at the first 4 verses in a few moments. Luke is the third of 4 Gospels that we have at the beginning of the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The Gospels are the story of Jesus. They're called the Gospels, which, by the way, that word just means good news, because they tell the story of the good news of Jesus. Each of the Gospels is written from a unique perspective of the 4 different authors that write them. Matthew was written by one of the original 12 disciples, a guy called Levi originally. He was a tax collector when Jesus called him to be a disciple, and then later he was called Matthew. He wrote primarily to the Jews. When you read Matthew, he writes about a lot of the Jewish tradition and the Jewish prophecies and the Jewish scriptures. He's writing primarily to the Jews to tell them that Jesus was this promised Messiah who came. Matthew chapter 1, verse 1 is often considered a key verse. I don't think I have this verse for you. It says, the book of genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. That's how Matthew starts his book, his gospel. Is he says, this is a chronology of Jesus' genealogy. He's a descendant of David, King David, and he's a descendant of Abraham. Why is that important? Well, because the prophecies said the Messiah was going to be a descendant of David who would rule like a king forever. And the prophecy said he would be a descendant, a seed of Abraham that would bless all the nations. And so Matthew is very clearly, right off the get-go, saying, Jesus is that guy to the Jews. Now, Mark was not one of the original 12 disciples, but Mark was a companion of Peter. And so Mark's gospel is sort of Peter's version of the story, if you will. Basically, Peter told him, and Mark wrote it down. Mark was written focused primarily on the Romans. And Mark's focus was portraying Jesus as a servant. Portraying Jesus as a servant. Often a key verse identified for Mark is Mark chapter 10, verse 45, where it says, for even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Jesus was portrayed as this servant who came to die for you and for me. John, like Matthew, he was one of the 12 disciples. His gospel was the last one written. It was written much later than the others, probably after 70 A.D. The other ones were probably written in the 50s or maybe early 60s of A.D. So John's was written probably even close to 100 A.D. We're not really sure exactly when he wrote it. He was an old man at that point in time. And he wrote from this perspective of kind of reflecting back on his life and his memories of Jesus and wanting to tell the story. He wrote primarily to a Greek audience. Lots of times in his gospel, he explains things in Greek and that kind of thing. So he's writing to a Greek audience. The key verse for John is found in John chapter 20, verses 30 to 31. It says, now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe. These are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah, the promised one, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. John wrote trying to convince you to believe that Jesus is the Christ. Luke, the book that we're going to be looking at, Luke was not an apostle. Luke was not one of the original 12 disciples or apostles. Unlike Mark, Luke was not writing for one of the 12 apostles. He was not a secretary for one of the 12, like Mark was to Peter. In fact, in the book of Luke, Luke is never actually identified as the author. We know he's the author because he's referenced in other books, particularly letters that Paul wrote later. We also know that he's the author because other historical documents and historical accounts reference him as the author of Luke. In fact, he wrote Luke and then he wrote the book of Acts as a 2-volume set, telling the story of Jesus and then telling the story of the church that came right after Jesus. Luke appears to be writing for a Gentile audience, a non-Jewish audience, and he's writing to assure his readers of the certainty of the truth of Jesus. He's writing to assure them of the certainty of the truth of Jesus. In fact, a key verse for Luke is one we're going to look at in more detail in a few minutes. Right in chapter 1, verses 3 and 4, he says, "It seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things that you have been taught." Luke writes from a very technical perspective, a very analytical perspective. I love it. I'm a former engineer. I love Luke's writing. It's very similar to the Apostle Paul's. Luke was a physician. He was a doctor, so he was very well trained, very well educated. We know that he's a physician because Paul actually tells us in Colossians that he was. In Colossians, Paul is talking about his companions, and in chapter 4, verse 14, he says, one of his companions was Luke, the beloved physician, who sends his greetings to you as well. He wrote in a very formal, sophisticated form of Greek. He and Paul were the two that wrote in a very formal, sophisticated form of Greek. Everybody else wrote in kind of a very simple form of Greek. If you ever take a Greek class, you don't want to study Luke and Paul. It's hard. You want to study John or Mark, they're easy. In fact, the first 4 verses we're going to look at today were one long run-on sentence in Greek. That was very common in Greek. That was good grammar in Greek, a very long, elaborate, complex sentence. Luke uses a lot of medical terms throughout his book because he's a doctor. He uses a lot of technical terms throughout his book. He often focuses on healing, miracles. It makes sense, right? He was a doctor. He was very interested in it. He gives excruciating detail about the birth of Jesus. Makes sense. He was a doctor. Let me just say a couple things about kind of the Gospels in general. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are often called the synoptic Gospels, the synoptic Gospels. Syn, S-Y-N, think synonym, right? Means the same or similar. Optic, think optician, means sight or eye or seeing. So those three tend to see the story of Jesus very similarly. They tend to have a lot of the same content, a lot of overlap between those three. Little differences here and there, but a lot of similarity. Versus John. John's very different in style and content from the other 4. You know, I like to think of the 4 Gospels because they're not exactly the same, and they're all telling the story of Jesus, like the 4 cameras at a football game. If you ever watch an instant replay at a football game, you think, oh, he was out of bounds, right? His knee was down. And it's not until you see the different camera angles that you can tell, well, was his knee down before his hand touched out of bounds? And did the ball cross the line before he touched out? Sometimes it takes multiple views to get the whole picture. And that's kind of how it is with the 4 Gospels. We have these 4 written by 4 different authors, each from sort of their perspective and their personality. But collectively, they give us the full picture of Jesus. So, let's jump into these first 4 verses. We're going to look at Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. I've titled this sermon this morning, Certainty of the Truth. Certainty of the Truth. So here's the first 4 verses. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things that have been taught. Notice with me in verse 1, Luke starts off by acknowledging that others have already compiled narratives. Others have already told the story of Jesus. He's probably referring to Mark and Matthew's Gospels that were written before his was written, but he might also be referring to other writings, other non-biblical writings that may have been written. These things would have been circulated around to the churches at this point in time, so the churches would be familiar with them, they would have read them, they would know them, they would have been teaching them to people. Notice also he uses this word accomplished. At least that's how the ESV translates it. These things that have been accomplished. Other translations use the word fulfilled. These things that have been fulfilled. You see, the idea here isn't just a list of historical events that took place. The idea here is these are things that fulfilled prophecies from the Old Testament. These are things that fulfilled promises from the Old Testament. You see, the Old Testament is promises made. The New Testament is promises fulfilled. The Old Testament is looking forward at what God was going to do. The New Testament is telling us what God did to fulfill those things. And so Luke starts off his gospel with indicating this idea of he's writing about these accomplishments, these fulfillments of Old Testament prophecies. And then I'm going to look with you at the very end of Luke. Luke chapter 24, verses 44 to 47. This is Jesus meeting with his disciples after he died on the cross and was buried and was raised again to life. And it's right before he's going to ascend to heaven. Look what Luke writes. Then he, meaning Jesus, said to them, "These are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled." Then he opened their minds to understand the Scriptures. And he said to them, "Thus it is written that the Christ should suffer and on the third day rise from the dead, and that repentance for the forgiveness of sins should be proclaimed in his name to all nations, beginning from Jerusalem." What Jesus tells his disciples right before he ascends back to heaven is, oh, by the way, everything in the Old Testament was pointing to me. And now I've come and I've fulfilled those things. I've done those things. And so Luke, he kind of bookends his gospel, if you will, by saying, I'm going to look at these things that have been accomplished. And then at the end he says, and Jesus is the one who accomplished these things. Notice with me in verse 2, back in Luke chapter 1. Luke references those who were eyewitnesses and ministers from the beginning. These are very technical terms. The first one, eyewitness, is from the Greek autoptes. Autoptes. It's where we get our word autopsy. Autoptes. It's where we get our word autopsy. It's the idea of examining something to understand what really happened. Examining something to really understand what happened. And so the idea here is Luke says, I'm gonna talk to the eyewitnesses, the people who have done the autopsy, the people who have seen it and examined it and understood it. And then the second term, ministers, is actually a word that means helper or intern or disciple. He's saying that his second source is those who were there helping Jesus. Those who were there a part of accomplishing these things with Jesus. Luke is like an investigative journalist or a historian, and he interviews the people who were there, the people who saw the events, the people who walked with Jesus and did these things with Jesus. As we go through this book, we're going to see that Luke often references very specific people, very specific places, very specific dates. Kind of like Old Testament, he talks about so-and-so was king, or so-and-so was governor, or so-and-so was high priest, all marking with validity what happened and when it happened. Notice with me in verses 3 and 4, Luke states that based on all of his investigations, it seemed good to him to write an orderly account. It seemed good to him to write an orderly account. The word here for orderly account can mean either a chronological order, I'm going to write things the way they happen, the timeline they happen, or it can mean a logical order. I'm going to explain them in a way that makes sense. I think Luke did a little bit of both. His gospel definitely follows a chronological order of Jesus' birth all the way to his death and resurrection and ascension. Him starting out in Nazareth and Galilee and then moving to Jerusalem and then ending up in Jerusalem. But it also follows a a theological order, if you will. We'll see that he portrays Jesus as a prophet and as a priest and as a king. All three roles that had been prophesied that the Messiah was going to fill. Luke writes to the most excellent Theophilus. He writes it to the most excellent Theophilus. We see this name here. We also see it again in Acts chapter 1, verse 1. Remember, it was a 2-volume set. And so in Acts, he again addresses Theophilus. In fact, he references his first book at the beginning of Acts, referring back to Luke. Now, the name Theophilus, it means friend of God, or one who loves God. Theos means God. Philo, Philadelphia, means brotherly love. And so this name means a friend of God, someone who loves God. And so some people think, well, this is sort of a collective pseudonym. Luke was just writing to the church. He was writing to the believers. He was writing to all the friends of God. And so he made up this name. That's probably not the case. Theophilus was probably an actual person. For one, Luke refers to him as most excellent. This was an actual title that would be used for governors and officials. In fact, in Acts, there's some stories where Luke references some governors and officials, and he calls them the most excellent. Felix and the most excellent. Some think Luke may have been a slave or a bondservant to Theophilus. That doesn't make a lot of sense to us. He was a doctor. Why would he be a slave or a bondservant to somebody? Well, back then, that was very, very common. People who had bondservants and slaves, they'd take the smart ones and they'd train them. They'd make them their own personal doctor or accountant or whatever that case might be so that they could work for them. We don't know that, nowhere is that referenced specifically. It appears that Theophilus was probably at least some official, probably some wealthy official who probably sponsored, bankrolled Luke to do this whole thing. And so Luke is writing back to him. This is what I found in my investigation. Lastly, notice with me in verse 4, Luke gives us the reason he's writing this gospel. He says that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught. That you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught. By the time Luke is writing this, the church was over 30 years old. Jesus had died on the cross and risen again over 30 years ago. The church was into at least the second generation. Kids had grown up in the children's ministry. They're now parents and teachers. We're on at least a second generation of teaching people the faith, teaching people the stories of Jesus. By now, several of the original 12 had been martyred and killed. There were certainly many questions, many misguided churches, many false teachers. There were rumors and stories and pagan practices that had started to enter into the church by this point in time. In fact, that's what most of Paul's letters are about. He's writing to churches to correct some of the things that have gotten into the church that need to be corrected. So it makes sense. At this point in time, Luke says, I'm going to set out and I'm going to find the truth for myself. I'm going to find the truth for myself. I'm going to talk to the people who were there. I'm going to talk to the people who were a part of the whole thing. And then he records it all very, very methodically, in great detail, as this historical account. And he says, I'm doing all of this so that you can be certain of the truth. It's interesting, the root word that Luke uses there for certain is actually sphalo. It means to lose your footing. It means to slip, to stumble, to fall. But then he adds an A on the front. And you know what happens when you add an A on the front? It means the opposite. Think anonymous. It means we don't know the name. Think amoral. It means somebody doesn't have morals. And so Luke actually says, so you can be a sphalo, so that you don't lose your footing, so that you don't slip or stumble or fall. He's saying, I'm writing this so that you can stand firm, unwavering, with confidence. You can be certain of the truth of Jesus, certain of the truth of who Jesus is, certain of the truth of what Jesus taught, certain of the truth of what Jesus did, and certain of the truth of why it all matters. I want to close with one final passage with you. Let me set this passage up just a little bit. Luke ends up very close friends with Paul. They end up going on several missionary journeys together. Luke is one of Paul's traveling companions on his missionary journeys. In fact, that's how Luke wrote Acts, as he was traveling with Paul as Paul was out planting churches and preaching the gospel. If you know the story of Paul, at the end of his life, he ends up in prison in Rome, where he's executed by Nero, who was the emperor at the time. But while he was in prison, he writes what is his last letter, the second letter to Timothy, his young protege off in Ephesus. And at the end of that letter, he includes some personal remarks in this letter to Timothy. And so I want to read for you 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 9 to 11. Paul writes, do your best to come to me soon. He's writing to Timothy. Do your best to come to me soon. For Demas, in love with this present world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia. Titus to Dalmatia. Luke alone is with me. Luke alone is with me. Paul's in prison. He's on death row. He knows he's going to be executed. Everyone's deserted him. Everyone has left him. He's writing to ask Timothy, please come see me. Please come see me. In fact, he goes on the later verses in this to talk about others who have left him. And he says, but there's one who's remained faithful. There's one who's here with me as I'm imprisoned, about ready to be killed. It's Luke. It's Luke. I don't think Luke's investigation and detailed recording of Jesus was just an academic exercise or just an investigative journalism exercise. I don't think he was writing just to convince Theophilus, or quite frankly, just to convince us. I think after Luke interviewed Mary and heard her tell the stories of Jesus' birth and Jesus' death, I think after Luke interviewed the disciples who walked with Jesus, lived with Jesus, I think after Luke interviewed those who maybe were still alive and had been healed miraculously, had been touched by Jesus, I think after Luke spent years with Paul, preaching the gospel and planting churches all over the world, being persecuted, shipwrecked, and suffering, I think after all of that, Luke came to certainty of the truth. Luke understood the sure footing of the truth of Jesus. Luke didn't waver. Luke stood with Paul up to the very end, even knowing he himself may be at risk. My prayer, my hope as we go through the book of Luke is that we become certain of the truth of Jesus, that we don't lose our footing, that we don't waver, we don't slip, we don't fall in who Jesus is, what Jesus taught, what Jesus did, and why it matters. Would you all please pray with me? Father, again, I thank you for all that you provide for us, all the blessings that you give us. I thank you that we can gather here to look at your word. I thank you for Luke. I thank you for what he did and what he wrote. I thank you for the testimony of his life. Father God, he's probably the second most influential writer in the New Testament. Behind Paul, he wrote more of the New Testament than anybody, and I thank you for that. Father, I pray that as we work our way through this book, that you'll just help us to see the truth of Jesus, the truth of who Jesus really is, the truth of what Jesus really taught, the truth of what he did and why it matters. Father, I pray all these things in the very name of Jesus. Amen.